Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you guys coming along, and hello to everyone that's watching online. So that was a great intro. Just to give you a little bit more background about me. So yes, I'm an Aussie. I can't really hide the accent too much, although it's starting to merge into something else because I moved to Africa about 4 years ago. So now I'm starting to pick up some of the colloquialisms there, and now the Aussies are disowning me because I don't sound like anything. So basically, I've been photographing wildlife for now coming on to 14 years as a professional job. And I did quite a few things over the time during that period, but the constant was always a passion for wildlife. So before I picked up a camera, I was actually a graphic designer and art director for almost 9 years. And so the animal side of things was definitely an ingrained passion that I then had as a side kind of project. So I would always volunteer with wildlife organisations and sanctuaries. I grew up around animals, all that kind of thing. And it just so happened that I got a camera and I started to photograph my own pets, which happened to be reptiles. And then I got very involved in taking a lot of reptile photography, which progressed to shooting for magazines. There are actually reptile magazines. I don't know how popular they are here, but certainly in Australia it's kind of a popular thing. And then that kind of took on a life of its own and progressed as well. And after a few years of doing that, I gave up the graphic design and kind of leapt into wildlife photography full time. And being quite a niche area, there were lots of things that I shot to pay the bills along the way. So, I mean, I've shot a lot of things. But the focus and the passion was always wildlife. And that actually evolved into pet photography. So I ran a pet photography business in Australia for about 7 years. And then 4 years ago, I basically sold everything that I owned, packed up and moved to Africa, and I haven't been back to Australia since. So the family's not too impressed with me on that aspect, but I'm hoping to get back for Christmas this year. So have to say though, they're not going to like the sound of this, but I haven't missed it for a single minute because basically those 4 years have just been constant back-to-back adventures and lots of different places and amazing animals. So hopefully I can share some stuff with you that will give you a bit of a glimpse into my life and our life. Now I started off mostly in still photography, and as technology has progressed, I've then moved into filming wildlife as well. So the beauty of the DSLRs these days is that usually you've got the video function as well. So it's pretty easy to actually start dabbling in filming, you know, without there being too much pressure of completely different equipment or anything like that. So I will admit I took a little while to transition over to that. It was one of those unknown areas that I was so comfortable in stills that I didn't really want to go into filming. But once I did, I was completely addicted. So now that has moved on to cinematic filming cameras. We shoot with Red, and I'll actually, if you saw the video that was just going by there, you would have seen the big camera equipment there, which we also use Tamron lenses on as well. So obviously I wouldn't be here unless I was a big fan of Tamron. And while I don't go into too much detail about every shot and what it was taken with, I will say that majority of the pictures that I've taken, certainly in the last 4 years, and that will be in this presentation, are with the Tamron 150-600. Definitely my go-to wildlife lens and a favourite. Really great focal length and a variety of focal lengths. Being quite small, I can't hold a 600mm prime and work all day with it. I just won't physically be able to do that. So I want a lens that I can actually use, that I'm actually going to use and can work with all day long. So that's where that comes in really handy. And I also really like the ability to zoom, because there are quite a few situations, especially with wildlife, where, you know, if you need the flexibility of a zoom because you can't physically, say, move in and out you might be stuck in a vehicle, safari vehicle or a boat. I've just come back from the Arctic, so you're in a Zodiac or on a big ship. You can't just sort of go in and out. And I want to be able to shoot a variety of compositions. So I want to be able to do tight shots, environmental shots, that kind of thing. So obviously the beauty of a zoom is I can do all of that even if I'm within the confines of a set area. So I'm just going to run through, it's a pretty short time, and I can tend to, I'm going to have to keep an eye on the time because I could just literally go on forever. So I'm going to rely on you guys to be like keeping me going. So I'm going to try to go over a few tips and sort of general principles that I keep in mind as I'm shooting for wildlife. So, because obviously it's quite a different, it requires different skills than something like a static subject. Definitely need a lot more patience, that's for sure. So I'm going to quickly go through just a couple of images just to give you a sense of my work. And then I'll start talking about some specific areas. So I obviously do a lot of work around Africa, being based there now, but I also work quite a lot in the Arctic. I go every year, and I've just come back from Indonesia. So in June I was in the Arctic for the month and then went straight to Indonesia, so big climate change. And I've been there filming Komodo dragons and orangutans. So we've just come out of the jungle straight to New York. So a bit of a mix. Yeah, and very humid. So a bit of a change. So this is actually quite nice and mild for me. So, I mean, pretty self-explanatory. One of the key things with wildlife is it's not waiting around for you to fiddle around with your settings too much. So to become really good at wildlife photography, one of the paramount things is going to be becoming familiar with your gear. And you know, it's quite handy, especially if you've had a camera body for a while, certainly for me, where I know where all the buttons are, because I will constantly be changing settings while I've got the camera up to my face, because, you know, if an animal is, say, going from static to moving and I want to change how I track focus and things like that, I want to know where everything is quickly, because that split second of when you actually get the chance to do that shot, it's going to be gone if you're there trying to go into menus and fiddling around. So what I do tend to tell people is, you know, it can be quite overwhelming learning all of the different aspects with shooting. So what I recommend is focusing on one area at a time, become really familiar with it, and then move on to the next. So if that's working out the exposure triangle, which is the combination of your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, focus on one. Get it to an understanding where you know exactly what that is doing, and if you're changing things, what it's doing, before moving on to the next thing, and then you will quickly start to realize how all of that works in together. And also, if you need to change things, which you want to change and why. So that's very, very handy. What I generally do is I'll either shoot mostly in manual or aperture priority mode. Aperture priority mode is really excellent for wildlife, because aperture is the one thing that I want to have absolute full control of, because that's going to determine the look and feel. It's the creative aspect of your image. How much is in focus? So not what's in focus, but how much. And you'll probably get a sense in my images that I like things to be quite shallow. I like to be very specific about where I'm focusing on and let everything else kind of fall away so the viewer knows exactly where to look quite quickly. And so that's determined by your aperture. So that's the one thing that I want pretty constant. And then everything else will then be based on the amount of available light. Also, whether the animal's moving or not, you know, there are decisions that I'm going to make after that fact. Obviously, wildlife. Fieldcraft is pretty important. So not only is it animal behaviour is one of the key elements, but it's also very much about patience, and I'll talk about that. And like I've got there, preparation and patience. So your preparation obviously is, you know, knowing your equipment, like we've said before, but also preparation in terms of understanding your environment and understanding the animal that you're working with. So it's really beneficial if you know about the animal. You can start to then interpret body language and start to predict behavior, and that's where your really great shots are going to come from, because you're ready for it when it's going to happen. And then, like I've said there, you've got to be ready and then hurry up and wait. There is a lot of waiting around in this job, definitely. And then there's also the consideration of safety. So, you know, with wildlife photography, it's certainly a potentially dangerous job, and I've had my fair share of encounters, and after 14 years, you know, that's to be expected. You know, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen, as they say. If you're going to be a chef, you're going to get cut or burn at some point, and it's the same with wildlife photography. I've had a few things along the way. So, yeah, there's been a cheetah mauling, which was not a great moment. That was probably my most serious to date, and very lucky, actually my fault completely. It was due to my own complacency that happened, and you know, that's for another time. I've got a video on YouTube that I put up about 2 years after the actual thing happened, because my husband filmed the whole thing, so everyone can enjoy it. I mean, I've had parasitic worms burrowing in my leg from Madagascar. I've picked up bacteria that was eating holes in my stomach. I don't even know where I picked that from. This one, I just collapsed of exhaustion after working for 2 years constantly, one job to the next, to the next, to the next. Very extreme environments, very, you know, lots of different food and unsanitary environments. You're living out of a tent in the bush for a long time, and then you go to maybe a nice lodge or all over the place. So it's just one of those things. And I'll get to why it actually is worth it in a second. But one of the things that I do like to reinforce with people, and this certainly can be relevant for any kind of photography, it can be relevant for any industry or vocation in life, but certainly wildlife photography, and that is what I call the 3 Ps. Practice, obviously, very, very essential. Patience is a really big key one, especially with wildlife, because you know, we can't direct the animal. I can't tell it to move this way or sit there for a while. You're at their mercy, and that's assuming that you've found the animal to photograph in the first place. So there's lots of waiting around, there's lots of tracking, and then perseverance is where it really comes in. You sort of go past that patience level, and you really then, that's when you start to get the really great images, because that's where you're putting in the time and the effort and the work. Including after, you know, you've been bitten or sick or whatever the case may be. But the next one is definitely passion. And I think for wildlife photography, it's especially poignant because, you know, if you don't have a passion for wildlife, you don't have a passion for the subjects that you're shooting, then you know, there's no reason for you to be there. There's no, that's going to be the key element that keeps you going in that area. So, you know, that might not be wildlife for you, but that might be some other form of photography or some other subject matter. So it's still relevant as well, and that's what keeps you going back. I got into, so photography came second after the passion for wildlife was always there. So even if I wasn't shooting or wasn't able to shoot, then I would always still have to be doing something with animals and around animals. So when I get to a point where, you know, things are quite hard, and that happens a lot, it's a very demanding job, I still feel this sense of appreciation that I even just get to be there, like in the presence of that animal, as well as being able to capture that. And then that leads on to me being able to share these images, and hopefully with people that it will ignite a sense of passion, because I realize how lucky I am that I actually get to physically see and encounter these things, because I want to be able to share those images with people that may never get to do that or actually get to see these animals in the wild. And that then also evolves into conservation. I do a lot of conservation work, filming and photography, and it's one of the things where you can't get heavily involved in an industry or an area like this and be out and exposed to so much and not then care about the, you know, the wildlife in general, you know, the habitat, the issues with poaching, and I could go on and on about it, but that's not why we're here today. But it's definitely ties into that element of passion and what keeps me going back. So another one being shooting in extreme conditions. So this was actually last year in the Arctic, but I've just come back from the Arctic again now. Again, it's it's an absolute privilege to be able to go up there and see these animals, but it's definitely not physically easy. I think I couldn't feel my fingers at this point. And then, you get a variety of locations, but very extreme environments. So this is where I've just come back from. This is in the jungles in Borneo. This is the film camera that I film on, which is red. So yeah, lots of variety, lots of physical challenges, and it is very much a male-dominated industry, I will say that, but I think there's a lot of women coming up more and more in this industry as well. And I think, mainly that's due to how physically demanding it is. There's a lot of heavy equipment to carry. You're in a lot of extreme conditions, but it's certainly not something that hopefully I can prove that women are certainly capable of, and hopefully excel at as well. Oops. So actually, if I click back here, you can see this behind the scenes. So I'm shooting here in a downpour. And it's one of those things where you don't, if it starts raining, I'm not going to stop shooting. It's actually quite a nice opportunity to get something really different. So that turned out to be really quite a nice moment with this leopard tortoise. Komodo dragons, this was about 4 years ago. So the time I just came back from last week, I only did filming actually, so I haven't got any stills of that. That'll be released later towards the end of the year. But you can see here I wanted to get kind of a different perspective. I got my long shots and I got my shots from a safe distance and the very compressed look. But I wanted to do something a little bit different and get a wide angle, very intimate environmental portrait. So that's where you start getting a little bit creative. And this is just a boom pole, usually used for a microphone. There's some wheels off like a toy. And so we've just got a base plate and mounted it on, and then I've got a remote trigger there, and I've got the trigger there in my hand. So literally I would just roll in and out and take some pictures. So yeah. Okay, so I'm going to get on to some photography fundamentals and things to keep in mind for photography in general. I mean, this can apply to anything. There are a few points that I'll touch on that are especially relevant to wildlife photography. And certainly that's my area, so that's what I'm going to focus on. So composition, obviously very important to a strong image. But one thing that I find that people really need to do, yes, it's a very dynamic, fast kind of shooting environment, but also don't forget to take the time to actually really look through your viewfinder, because it can be quite easy to be so focused on the animal or just getting your focal point over the animal that you're not actually seeing what's in the background or how you're composing the shot. That's very, very important. And it's one of those stronger aspects that can really make a mediocre wildlife image into a really compelling one. So one of the things that I suggest for people who are a little unsure about composition and what is a strong composition is that shoot a bit wider to begin with. And then once you have the picture downloaded, then you can start playing around with cropping options and work out what compositions work best. And you'll quickly start to develop a quick understanding of what makes a strong composition and image. And then you'll start to do that in camera. So that's a nice way to take the pressure off a little bit in the beginning and get a real sense of it. So, yeah. I also like to encourage people, and like I said with the zoom lenses before, mix it up a little bit. Don't just do all close-ups or all full body shots, especially if you've got the zoom, or if you can physically move around, then try to get a bit of variety. Get all the shots that you need to get. Make sure you've got your safe shots out of the way, and then start getting a little bit creative, because you don't need 50 plus shots of the same angle and the same composition. If you know you've got it, say in the first 5 or 10, great, start mixing it up and moving it around. So I really like to make sure I try and get some wide shots, something environmental to give people a sense of place. And then I can start moving on to, I'm not going to do that if it's not a very interesting area, but generally that's what I would like to do. And then I'll move on to something a little bit more intimate, and that's where you can start to see how I really like to use my separation. That choice of shallow aperture and that separation of subject really comes into play as you zoom in and you start working with longer focal lengths, because you get compression with that lens and the focal distance. And then don't forget to do some detail shots as well. I mean, this is definitely one of my most popular images. It's a bit of, I'm trying to think of the toothpick, shot. So, it's just something a little interesting. I did quite a few shots of this zebra, and I did, bits of the ear. I filled the frame with the stripes. I did some with the mane, because their manes are quite short and they just stick out a little bit, so it's sort of like this perfect angle. But this was the one that stuck out a little bit because, there's a little bit of comedy to it. So they're the ones that tend to be memorable. Negative space I use a lot, actually, and it can be really strong in composition. And I think one of the reasons that I like to use it so much is I like things to be relatively simple. I like a minimalist look. But I think also my design, art direction background has really influenced how I see things, because I used to work with images before I started taking them. I needed to know how it's going to work within a composition. Certainly in the traditional sense, is there room for copy space? Things like this that go through my mind. So even without any of that relevance in the end use, it still makes for a really strong image rather than just sticking everything in the middle. Don't stick everything in the middle, not unless there's a really good reason. Maybe there's a nice reflection to work with, or it's very symmetrical, something like that. Otherwise, I definitely recommend, move it around and work with some negative space, and it can help give some tension to the image. It can also help lead the viewer's eye. So for example, you'll notice that these two are looking into frame. I like to have, the animal looking into frame. If this bird was looking this way, I would have framed it so that he was on the right. And so what I've noticed is when I'm shooting, I'll have because I'll often, in a static situation like this where the animal isn't moving, I'm using a static focus point. So I use a back button focus actually, just so I can separate out my focus and my shutter. But anyway, I lock in focus, and then I will constantly be going like this. If the animal is kind of looking around and turning, I will constantly be moving with it to get my composition with this in mind, with negative space. The other thing you certainly can do is have it over here, and that actually creates quite a sense of tension. If the animal's looking straight into, you just don't want it to be too close. So you don't want to cut it off like it feels like it has nowhere to go. It's really nice if you can lead the eye in and across the frame. But one of the key things with photography is it's a creative outlet and it's an art form. There are rules, but there are no rules, really. I mean, you just got to get out there and be creative, and then you'll get a sense of what appeals to you as an individual as well. Perspective is a really key one. So this is a prime example. This is the exact same chameleon on the exact same branch, and the only difference is that I've moved around, and obviously his temperament has changed as I've done that. He's getting a little more annoyed as we go. So I did either these two shots first, I don't remember. It was possibly this one. But you can see in these two, he's still quite relaxed. He's nice and bright. He's not, actually it must be this one because he's starting to darken up a little bit there. So I've come in, and this is with the 150 to 600. So I'm actually not that close, but he was very aware of my presence, obviously. And the beautiful colors onto these autumn-looking leaves here. So I've done this shot, and then as I've moved around, I'm really looking through that viewfinder, and I see that actually in the background there's some really nice yellow color. There's a different bush behind. So then I've moved, and you can see from I'm more at an angle like this, whereas before I was straight on. So I started moving around like this. And then he's starting to really notice me, starting to get a little bit darker. He's trying to look bigger. And then I've basically just worked around different areas. So make sure that you utilize, if you can and if you can do it safely, like I said, really look at everything in your frame. Look at the background. Try to get rid of any distracting objects that could simply just mean like an inch or a centimetre over this way, and you have a completely different composition. Because that's a huge amount of variety just for that animal not even moving at any point, and simply me changing my perspective. The other one, especially with wildlife, is to get low. The one key thing that I really like to do, if I physically can, is to get to eye level or even lower, if possible, because it just gives a completely different sense. If I shot this snake, say even like standing, but even crouching position, I'm still going to be looking down, and I'm basically just going to get dirt around it. I won't have as much separation because, the ground is more parallel to me, so there's going to be a lot more in focus. It's going to be busier, far less interesting. But by getting down right on the ground, and I spend a lot of my time in the dirt on the ground, you actually get a sense of environment, and you get a sense of how the world is perceived from their view, which is, I think, really, really important, especially if you're trying to, translate that in your images. You want something that's going to grab people's attention. And also, it gives me a lot better chance of that separation that I really like. So obviously I'm focused here on the eye and the face, and you can see that shallow line that's in focus here, and then everything else falls away. I also could have shot that at a higher aperture and had more in detail, and still, had a nice separation where I could have maybe got focus back sort of to here. It just means that all of this would be a little bit more defined, but still certainly out of focus. So like I said, I do that a lot if it's safe. You would have seen the picture at the beginning with the rhino, where I was on the ground filming. That's generally not recommended, but I had spent a long time getting to that point, and the angle of that photograph makes it look closer than what I actually am. So we spent hours assessing that animal. It was very, very relaxed. Most of the time it was laying down with its calf, completely unfazed by our presence. And I worked my way very, very gradually in, and they've got up at one point. The calf has been very, very curious, so it started to come in. We've assessed. The mother was very chilled, didn't care, and then the calf got a bit nervous and ran back to mum. So that actually made for some really nice footage. I was filming there, so there was lots of it was doing a bit of stamping, trying to assert itself because it was so young, so there was lots of dust kicked up, and it was very, very sweet. If that mother had in any way shown any discomfort, there's no way I could have got in that close. So, and the other thing that I also take into consideration is that I'm fully aware of the risks that I take, and it's my fault if something happens. So the people that I work with, so I had to have a ranger there that's responsible for that area on a reserve. So a reserve in South Africa is not like captive animals, but it's a set region of land that is named, and that certain people are responsible for the upkeep and anti-poaching and things like that. So there are rangers that their full-time job is to be looking after the animals, like checking where they are, taking people out on safari, that kind of thing. So I had to make sure I had someone with me and that it was all done safely and within their expectation. They wouldn't, normally you don't just go along and you can't do that, but there was the understanding of experience, obviously, and an understanding of body language as well, which is really important. Eye contact is another really good one. So it's one of those things that can take a good image, but make it, maybe take it to that next level. So you don't necessarily always want eye contact in wildlife photography, but there are definitely a lot of situations where I really, really like it. So for example, I have quite a few images in this sequence of the macaque, and that's in Bali in Indonesia. and it's busy looking at its hands and playing with the leaf and kind of chewing but not really eating it. And I have quite a few pictures, but this is the one that stands out to me. So that's what kind of makes image selection easy for me as well. If I've taken a sequence of shots and there's, say, 5 or 10 images, it's the one with eye contact that I'm generally going to pick out, especially if they're quite similar. So I think, you're able to get that connection with the viewers. Action. Yeah, not one of the easier ones, but certainly worthwhile practicing. Basically, your middle focus point is your most sensitive. So something just to keep in mind. If you are trying to track movement, that's going to be your most accurate focal point. And I'll go back to that one, especially if I have any tricky light, if the light's starting to get a little bit low, or if the subject is low contrast, so maybe it doesn't really stand out from the background as much, that middle focus point is going to be a lifesaver for you for tracking. And while I don't have time to go into detail about focusing modes and how I do all that, I do have an ebook which I'll mention at the end, which I go into a lot more detail about. So obviously if you're wanting to capture action and you want to freeze it, higher shutter speed is going to be a priority, which actually works in really well with the style of shooting that I like to do, which is shallow, so I'm using a low aperture number. So it goes hand in hand, I get the benefit of both. And like I said, that middle focus point, especially in low light. So this one, for example, you can see it's dusk already. So actually I'm going really quite low. And for a cheetah, normally I'd want to go quite high with my shutter speed. This one from memory, I think was only like 500th of a second, like it was actually pretty slow for action, what you would consider. But I had to kind of balance that out with an ISO that I didn't want too high and grainy. And I was at my lowest aperture already. So this was a 70 to 200. So I was shooting at 2.8 already. So that's kind of the payoff that I got. And it was still able to freeze it, which is fine. And just so you know, it's going for the baby, not this massive zebra here, which it would never have a chance at getting. And that, unfortunately, for the cheetah, was a failed attempt 2 times. They actually chased 2 times of that same herd, but yeah, didn't quite get it. So now with the sifaka in Madagascar, the beauty of this, and also if you're using a continual tracking mode on your camera, is that this guy, he was doing this quite a bit. Like he was jumping, they go from tree to tree, and their hips are actually designed in a way that they can't move forward. So they have to go like this. So it's actually quite adorable. And you can see, I mean, their feet are perfectly designed for trees. It's almost like a chameleon foot, but just massive. So they kind of do this dance, hop along. And I could see this was quite a wide dirt road. So it started at a tree on the other side. So, it's looking there. There's a couple that had gone before it. You kind of could predict that it was going to do that as well. So I just made sure that I was in a continuous focus mode, got my focus, and then I just kept on it. I also made sure I got really low on the ground and in the middle because I want the least amount of distraction behind. And then I've done a sequence of shots as he's gone along. So I've got a few different ones. And this one and a couple of other ones where he has the nicest body. So that's why I've chosen that. And the camera has done a really good job. This is the 150 to 600. And it's done a really great job. I've used that middle focus point again, just because I want to really lock in on that. But the other thing too is sometimes I'll use, for something like this where you can see it's white on a darkish background, the camera's generally not going to have an issue of finding focus. It was quite dark though, so that was one of the considerations. So I will use multiple points. So I'll start with a middle focus point, lock it in, but that's where in a continuous focus mode, your camera will look at those points around that middle point and do a really good job of tracking it as well. And I've just made sure that I'm trying to keep it pretty much in center of frame for most of that time. Yeah. Then kind of the opposite of that is intentional blur. Now you can definitely use intentional blur if you get to a point where you run out of available light, and at this point you can't take a sharp image anymore. But it's definitely something that don't forget to use even in other situations. I mean, I did this in full sunlight, and so I've manipulated all my settings to do that on purpose. So I've shot this at 1/8 of a second. I didn't have a neutral density filter to bring all that light down, but what I've done is I've made my aperture like the absolute highest that it can possibly go for that lens, and my ISO as absolutely low as the camera will let me. And that combination, I did a few test shots and worked out around 1/8 of a second worked quite well for me because I wanted to really have a blur, give a sense of busyness and movement. And so I've locked on to, at this point, aperture doesn't really matter because pretty much everything's sort of going out of focus, with the blur. So I've just locked onto that wildebeest and I've tracked along as I press the shutter with him. So what you find is that, everything else starts to get even more extreme blur, and then you get a little bit there. So you could up your shutter speed as well and actually make this one, if you do a few and you track your camera kind of close to the animal, you can actually get quite a sharp shot, and then all the rest will be in blur. That's a really nice option as well. And then this bird here, the guillemot, this was just from my recent trip in the Arctic. So what I've done was I've gone with a 200th of a second shutter speed. Now, if I shoot birds, usually I'm going to start at minimum 1,000th of a second to really lock it in. So for this, I wanted to be able to get some sharpness and lock in some that I track with, but knowing that the wings are going way too fast for that, so you get some nice blur, makes it a bit more interesting. And then, of course, everything in the background, because you're moving along with it, is going to pick up some of that blur. So it just gives you something a bit different from your traditional sharp shot all the time. But it's definitely a lifesaver once I get to a point where I don't have much light anymore. So, for example, if it's getting, after sunset, but I want to keep shooting. If the alternative is that you don't take any more pictures, I mean, we're in the age of digital. It's not costing you anything to process the images. Why not have a play? So that's where then I'll really start to play around with my movement, or if the animal's moving, just let that happen and go static, and start playing with different shutter speeds to come up with results. And if they're throwaways, then they're throwaways. It doesn't matter. That also goes into the theme of don't stop shooting. Just because, the light might not be perfect anymore, that can be some of the nicest shooting situations. That's where you have to get creative, and it can produce some really nice results. And one of the other things too is, especially, dawn and dusk, is shooting silhouettes and doing that purposefully. So to get a really nice silhouette, you want to underexpose. So that's where I'll intentionally underexpose so that, for example, I'm not blowing out the background and the light anymore. That's where I really want to bring in some color and drama, because I don't mind how dark the foreground's going to be. Obviously, this only works in situations where you have, the light behind the animal. So the lower you get, generally the better, because then you don't have, distracting ground behind it, but you get really, really low and you're just seeing sky, then that's really quite perfect for it. And again, so if you're shooting in a manual mode, simply you just play with either raising your shutter speed so it's very, very high, or you can raise your aperture. So either or a combination of both, so that you intentionally underexpose the image. Or if you work in any kind of auto mode, so if that's aperture priority or shutter priority or complete auto or anything with auto ISO, then you can use exposure compensation. So you don't have to necessarily go out of that mode and go into manual. You can just use your exposure compensation and go click towards the minus, make sure it underexposes quite a bit. Check your screen, and then adjust accordingly. Yeah. So wildlife photography, it's one of those things where, you think there's a lot of luck involved. And there is, definitely. This is a prime example of probably one of my favorite images. And I often get asked if it's a composite, and I don't do composites, so no, it's not. But it's one of those situations where I was shooting and I was doing some continuous focus, and I did see the egrets come in. I didn't see them like exactly perfect like that, only when I looked at my viewfinder afterwards, but I definitely saw them coming in. So it actually is 3 separate birds, it's not one bird. And that's one of those moments where I kind of checked the back and squealed out loud, which doesn't happen very often. Not a whole lot phases me anymore, but that was a pretty good moment. So, but what I will emphasize is, you know, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. If I wasn't prepared, i.e. with my gear or understanding my equipment, then I wouldn't have got the shot. And then the opportunity is if I wasn't there, if I don't get out and I actually do it and be there and put myself in that situation, also I'm not going to have that luck. So it's the prime saying, the luckier you get, the harder you work, vice versa. So yeah, definitely something that you need to create your own luck with. So I'm going to go through a couple of images, and I want to, now that we've gone over a few of those points, try to keep in mind those, because while I've separated out those points, they're things that you should be considering at the same time as you're shooting, things to think of. And it's one of those things like driving a car. So the more you do it, the more intuitive it gets. It gets to the point now when you do become familiar with your equipment and your gear, that the technical side of things, it starts to fade away because you know what you're doing, and that only comes with practice. So I know when you first get your license, you know, there's so many things to think about. It's overwhelming. What are you doing? What's the other car doing? What are the signs? Blah, blah, you know, too many things. But then, you know, over time, it's all intuitive, and you can just focus on, you know, where you're going or the signals or, you know, what other crazy people are doing. So it's exactly the same with photography. Lots and lots of practice, and it becomes intuitive, and then you have more, you know, focus to really take notice of the actual creative decisions and technical decisions while you're shooting, really looking through the viewfinder, really framing purposefully, positioning things, what focusing modes you're using, that kind of stuff. So, and you know, I am very, very fortunate that I get to go to some really amazing places, but all of these are completely relevant to any subject that's moving. So really, you know, you could apply this, like I did pet photography for a really long time, and that's where I got a really solid understanding of working with moving subjects. And it was a nice kind of ease into that because I could kind of work with the animals a bit. I used to have a squeaky attached to my camera. I had treats with me. So, you know, I could kind of manipulate them into somewhat doing what I wanted, but I also like to capture them doing, you know, their own thing, running around at the beach or the park or whatever. So I got a lot of good practice in tracking moving subjects and doing that kind of thing, shooting low especially. And that's relevant for, it doesn't have to be wildlife, it can be any animal, it could be kids, like, you know, little toddlers running around. It's all the same principles. And then your creative aspects are very much relevant to any kind of photography. And, you know, if it's not a moving subject, it just means that you have a bit more time to consider all those things, which is quite nice as well. That would be nice. So, yeah, this is from the trip that I've just done in the Arctic. So I do a lot of, I'll do a lot of different shots, but it's then, you know, when you shoot so much, I actually start to become quite particular on when I'm then pressing the shutter, because I know that I have to go back through a lot of images. And when it's, you know, your full-time job, it's like anything, you start to become efficient in it. So that's where I'm then really looking for moments. I can look through a viewfinder and I can see a beautiful scene, but I know whether I'm going to do anything with it or not. But when there's sort of moments like this, that's when it starts to get really special. So I've got some nice shots of, you know, the baby just swimming by itself or the mum just swimming by itself, but it doesn't quite compare when you can get some sort of emotional moment or contact, which is really quite nice. So this was shot with the Tamron 15-30. So the wide angle you don't really generally associate with wildlife photography. You tend to think zoom, and certainly 70-200 and the 150-600 are absolute go-tos and really nice focal lengths for animals and wildlife. But there are definitely some situations where a wide can really give you something unique, and especially if you're going for an environmental style shot. And especially if it's an animal that you can safely get to. I say safely, but this one did actually bite me on the neck, of all things. But still, nothing, it kind of barely broke skin. But I was trying to do it a favor and move it off the road because there's like cars and carts and all sorts of things, and then I got bitten for it, so well, that's okay. I'm a huge reptile fan, like I said at the beginning, so I'm just like, I was really happy to find it. So this is in the iconic Baobab Alley in Madagascar, which is quite a well-known area. And this is actually a giant Malagasy chameleon, or Malagasy giant chameleon. And yeah, it was just one of those things where, again, I'm down in the dirt and the wide angle is just absolutely perfect for it. So I cannot remember what actual focal length I was at, but I'm pretty sure I was at 17 because I was trying to get as much of these massive trees in as possible. So, so he was very, very close. I think, maybe this close to the lens. And, it's not gonna generally, like, you can't do that with wild cats or whatever, not if you're actually behind the camera. So, yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. Don't always necessarily go for your long lens. And also, if you do other kind of photography where you're maybe using a 24-70 or, the wider stuff, maybe you're doing portraits, that kind of thing, then definitely don't get in the mindset that you can't then utilize it on stuff, because there's going to be, there's insects or, small animals maybe around, or pets or that kind of thing, that you can get some really interesting stuff. It doesn't always have to be the long lens. This was 70-200. And again, I shot this at f4 so that I could get quite a bit of his face and fur in focus, but really wanting to blur out that background like I do. That's kind of my thing. So again, I've spent a long time kind of making my way up to this animal and this troop in particular. And to me, this shot kind of symbolized, I don't know, it represented something about his life, because while he was with a big troop, and baboons, they're so gregarious, they're playing and touching and running around and foraging, and this guy was just sitting on the sidelines. So I couldn't really work out whether, he's got these massive scars down his face there. So I can't work out if he's, maybe he's been the alpha of that troop, and he's been, extricated. I don't know what's happened, but he had kind of this peaceful but almost defeated presence about him, and he stayed by the troop, but didn't really interact with them anymore. So I found that kind of interesting, and I spent many hours with the troop and worked my way in closer, and they were just, they didn't care. They were just busy doing their own thing. Because he was on the outside, I got closer to him first, and every now and then he'd just open his eyes and check where I was, and then back to like in the sun and stuff like that. So, yeah. This for me symbolizes not going for the traditional kind of style picture, because generally you would look at a scene like this and you'd wait for them all to put their head up, or like most of them, or whatever the case may be. You don't really see a lot of pictures where they're kind of, this many, and they're all down, because they're usually eating up here, up high. This was in Namibia, which you're gonna love. And yeah, it was just one of those things where I noticed that they were all kind of going up and down, and then I've waited for that moment where they've all gone down together, which is really nice. But one of the things that really I like about this particular image is the storm coming in from behind. So you get a really unique color match here. I've got sunlight straight on the foreground on the front, and I've got my white balance shooting for sunlight. So this massive storm that's building and coming in from behind has then got these really blue tones, very dramatic. So yeah, definitely one of my favorite light combinations is that storm and dark, ominous background with some sunlight still coming in on the foreground. It's supposed to be fun. That's what I like to remind people, because you can get so overwhelmed with the technical side of things, and yes, you need to definitely work through that in practice. But I mean, the whole point is that it is supposed to be fun. It's a creative outlet, or perhaps it is your profession. But, it's one of those things with wildlife. Enjoy it, enjoy the moment. Don't forget to actually stop and look and appreciate the moment. Because, it's fine. It's one thing to go back and look at all your images, and yes, you can absolutely relive it, and I'm very aware of that. But I definitely still have my moments where I'm not gonna miss a shot for it, but I will take a moment and appreciate the moment, and enjoy the animals, or especially if an animal has let me into their space, like the actual presence. And the other thing too is there's a lot to be said with wildlife photography about your energy around animals. If you're incredibly frustrated with your settings, and perhaps the animal isn't doing what you kind of want it to do, that tension in your body, they can pick up on that. So you get back what you put out, and if you come in with a relaxed attitude and a very calm attitude, that's where you're going to get a really nice response out of the animals, because they're not going to think they have a reason to be afraid of you. It still comes down to common sense and safety, and interpreting animal behavior and not putting yourself in ridiculously dangerous situations. But certainly if you bring in all this negative tension and energy, they're going to pick up on that, because that's how they interpret the world. If that one's tense, I should probably be tense, because there's obviously something dangerous out there. So definitely something to keep in mind, and then just experience and practice. That's definitely what I would recommend. So I did mention my book before, so I go into a lot more detail, because this is quite a short amount of time that we can touch on stuff. I can't really get into the nitty-gritty technical side of things. So I have an ebook on my website, and it's about 60 pages, and I go through all photography fundamentals. I go through equipment, fieldcraft, all sorts of things. I also go through my post-production in Lightroom, from a raw image right through to finished product, and I have screen grabs step-by-step of all of that too. So that you can check out on my website, which is just shannonwild.com. So you can just go into the shop link, and that's where I've got my ebook. I also have a pet photography ebook, if that's more your thing. Certainly the same principles as well. Generally, I don't go into as longer focal lengths, just because if it's pet photography, you still want to actually be able to interact with the animal a bit. But generally, it's giving you an idea. The other thing too is, in all of the pages, every image, I've got all the settings that I've used. So just so that you can get an idea. One thing I want to stress about, don't focus too much on looking at all the settings for everything, because while absolutely you can learn a lot that way, you don't have context of the situation, the light, all of that kind of stuff, which is really paramount. You also need to combine that with understanding what the photographer was trying to communicate at that time, why they chose those settings, because they might have got a similar result, certainly a perfectly exposed image with different settings. So there's an actual reason why these settings have been decided. So it's a really good way to reverse engineer and get an idea of how someone's shooting and what they're using. But just be aware that you need to also learn about why they're doing it, and that's going to be key when you're out shooting as well. So that'll give you an idea. I also have an expeditions page, so I've got future expeditions that I lead in the Arctic, Madagascar, all over the place. So I'll put those up there if that's something that you're interested in. And then the other thing I just wanted to let you know is that I have a jewellery line that I started, and that's it's to support wildlife conservation. So I have a portion of every sale that goes to a wildlife conservation organisation, and at the moment that is a foundation called Wild Tomorrow Fund, and Wendy's up the back there. And it's actually New York based, but they do some really amazing work, especially in an area in South Africa where they do land acquisition So protecting habitat, which is really vitally important. So yeah, certainly something if you're into that kind of thing, then you know that your money's going in good hands. Alrighty, so that's me. So I think that's pretty much done for me. Yeah, I don't know how I went on time there. Thank you.